Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome again to our Spring School Interdisciplinarity in DigiTech Research. So we are nearing towards the end of our first day to what I personally call a grand finale, which is going to be a keynote lecture that will sort of kick off officially our spring school. But before that, I would like to welcome here on the podium the director of our department center for is it possible that I just forgot the name of the center? Center for Science, Technology and Society Studies, which Dr. Jan Ballon from the Institute of Philosophy. So technically my boss, and he's gonna, who just witnessed this a little funny moment. But anyway, I would like to welcome Dr. Jan Ballon, who's gonna say a few introductory words to the participants of our spring school. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Yes, I'm here on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and obviously I would like to extend a cordial welcome to all participants of this event. We are pleased that that there is a chance to host this initiative that is aimed at understanding of the implications of digitalization on temporal perception. I'm a sociologist, so it is of particular interest for me too, because in today's society, the pervasive influence of digital technology has altered the structure of our daily lives and blurred the boundaries between work and personal time. I think we all experience this, and the timed project seeks to systematically examine these changes and their impact on individuals and societies. So this is a very, very challenging task, I think, and as the hosting institution, we are happy to be part of this project, and thanks to Wanda and Teresa, we are all committed to providing a conducive environment and for the exploration and exchange of ideas throughout the duration of this project. We anticipate that the findings generated will contribute significantly to scholarly discourse and also to societal understanding. The director of our institute, who couldn't come, so he also sends his best regards and urged me to extend our appreciation to all participants for their involvement and dedication to this endeavor. So may your event foster insightful discussions and may its outcomes propel the advancement of your crucial project. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the warm welcome, and the next speaker that I would like to invite to join us on the stage would be Jakub Nekolný, who is a representative of the Prague municipality from the Department of Culture and Tourism. I got it right this time. So, Mr. Nekolný, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. And I have to apologize for my English. I am not a native speaker. Therefore, I will read my speech from the paper. But I promise you that it would be long and you can continue in your program. As a representative of the Department of Culture and Tourism of Prague's municipality, I would like to welcome you and wish you a nice evening and nice tomorrow and Friday too. It's my privilege to receive you in Prague and give a short speech. It is also my pleasant duty to let you know that the Spring School, under the patronage of Prague's Deputy Mayor, Mr. Jiří Pospíšil, we appreciate it in event connecting science and culture, as we are making efforts to introduce science into culture. If we want to know and understand something, we have to learn how to describe and measure it, which is not always an easy task in culture. This is a reason why we strive to systematically build up our knowledge of culture. We want to recognize the culture players across the particular culture facilities the culture offer. We also want to recognize the audience and their preferences. Last but not least, we want to recognize the regional reserves and potential for the development of culture and creative branches. For this purpose, we have developed an innovative culture data collecting tool called MAPKA. It's behind me. It's M-A-P-K. That's mean map of culture. And introduced this tool at Prague Culture Forum this week on Monday and Tuesday. MAPK integrates conceptually collected data, for example, of culture, infrastructure, events, funding, on the behavior of the population. The data needed is gained from dozens of datasets, such as ticketing organizations, databases of economic entities, general public surveys, culture behavior surveys, emotional maps, and so on and so forth. This all will not only enable to monitor the culture distribution in Prague, but also help the capital with analysis and strategic planning. Hopefully, it will also contribute to the development of culture and creative branches in Prague. One of the difficult tasks is to evaluate, clear, verify, and effectively utilize such data in the future. For this task, we have got assistance from Creative Prague, a municipal organization. Further on, we count in this in the academic sector. The whole project is just being piloted, and it's available in address mapk.cz. Another innovative tool is Evaluart, and as its name suggests, is designed to evaluate for the time being just the municipal culture organization. And in the future, we expect to extend it on the beneficiaries of culture subsidies and grants from Prague budget. More and more municipalities and institutions have already shown their interest too. Evaluart helps monitor meeting Prague's culture policy and particular organization strategies, statement of affairs of organizations towards their establishers and other public administrations, institutions too. And finally, enables to monitor performances indexes such as turnout and receipts. In case of the participation of more entities than the current 16 Prague's organization, and we allow us to segment the particular entities, mutually comparing similar facilities. The third and last innovative tool is in the area of tourism. This is a mobile application called Visitis, designed to dynamically manage the tourist industry. Again, we are talking of work with crucial data, its collection, analysis, and evaluation. Knowing the numbers of visitors of science or other point of interest together with define concepts, particular nationalities associated with Prague, this application will offer visitors effective tourist trails. Prediction and data sharing will result in operative management of tourism in Prague. Having evaluated the reference data, the current culture offer might be adjusted and new product will be created. These three examples are to provide that even generally rigid public administration has potential to utilize and creative, if not scientific, approach to the issue. In conclusion, let me wish the DigiTech Research Spring School a lot of success and to enjoyable stay in Prague in City of Culture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Mr. Nekolny too for the both welcome words, but also showing us how the city of Prague is using digital technologies in culture and tourism. Very exciting. And without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Ysabel Gerrard, who is a senior lecturer in digital communication at the University of Sheffield. Her research explores youth culture and on social media, including topics like mental health moderation, anonymous apps and bullying, and digital photo editing and body image. Ysabel's academic research has been published in journals like New Media and Society and the Internet Policy Review. And she has also written for non-academic outlets like The Guardian and Wired. She has a forthcoming book with the University of California Press titled The Platform Paradox: Understanding Young Lives on Social Media, and can be found too on social media, Blue Sky Social, under her first name. So without further ado, Ysabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Is there a clicker? Oh, lovely. Thank you. Got it. Wonderful. Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking to everybody about interdisciplinarity in digital research. I'm going to start by explaining a bit about my background and who I am. But before I do any of that, I just want to extend a really, really big thank you to the organizers of this event. They've just been, you know, all of the backstage work that they've done, all the effort that they've put into getting everyone here. I just think it promises to be an absolutely wonderful event, and they deserve the first round of applause. So if you join me. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who I am, and then I'm going to talk about what digital media are and why we should research them. It's a deceptively simple question with complicated answers. And then there's going to be a little bit of kind of Ruth Ysabel overlap here, where we talk about some of the promises and challenges of interdisciplinarity. And then I'm going to introduce you to some research that I've been doing recently. It's not my most research, but it is recent, and it's a good chunk of the book. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reimagine if I was to do this research with an interdisciplinary hat on, because I will confess that I am someone, and somebody said it earlier and I'm not sure who, but I'm someone who has relatively recently arrived at interdisciplinarity. Like, it wasn't something in my department when I did my PhD that I kind of embraced or saw as the opportunity that it was, and it was something I was a bit scared of. And so now that I move forward in my career, building interdisciplinary teams and addressing problems from an interdisciplinary lens is something that I'm trying to prioritize. So I'm not an expert, I'm not perfect at any of the things that I'm going to say. So I'm really excited for you to join me on this kind of learning adventure over the next few days. So my name's Ysabel. It's pronounced Isabel. It's just spelled a bit weird. And my pronouns are she, her. So I'm a senior lecturer, which is kind of the same as an associate professor at the University of Sheffield in the UK. I got my first position there as a lecturer in 2017, and then I got promoted, not this January, just gone, the one before, after one failed attempt and one successful attempt. And I got my PhD in Media and Communication at the University of Leeds. So my discipline is very much media and communication, and I now kind of find myself in a Department of Sociological Studies, thinking that those things were quite similar, but actually realising that there are still lots of different approaches that I have learned about. So I research youth cultures and social media. I've researched lots of different kinds of youth culture. So I kind of started out by thinking about mental health moderation. And then I moved on to focusing on anonymous apps, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So apps where they're really popular with kids, where you can just send someone a message and they don't know who sent it. I've been working with Kate Miltner, who's also at Sheffield, on a project about tech nostalgia. We wrote a paper for Internet Histories where we thought about why millennials in particular really missed MySpace and where all of these memes about MySpace have come from, which was a really fun piece, but actually quite telling. And finally, my most recent project, and this is like a baby new project, I got some funding from my department to do a pilot study with teenagers at a private school in Northern England, where I asked them about their feelings and experiences about digital photo editing. So this is kind of specifically of the face and body, so kind of distorting your face or erasing what they would call their flaws, which they're not, they're beautiful, but you know. And yeah, I went into this pilot thinking, okay, what's the groundwork that needs laying? What are the questions? What research do we already have? What do we need to know? And it was just, as I said, a pilot. And then I'm now trying to develop this into a bigger project with the AHRC, which is ironic for tomorrow. And then finally, I am someone who engages across sectors. So I am an unpaid advisory board member for Meta. Haven't ever taken a penny from them. I'm on their suicide and self-injury advisory board, and I've done that since 2019 with some skepticism. And then I joined the Five Rights Foundation for a secondment in 2022, and this was where Five Rights is a children's policy organisation in the UK. And then in 2017, I did a research internship at the Social Media Collective at Microsoft, and that was thoroughly interdisciplinary. It was the most interdisciplinary environment I've ever been in my life, and I learned more in that 12-week period than I probably learned in the 3 years after it. So yeah, I'm very proud to have kind of developed these things. So that's a little bit about me. But more importantly, what I want to talk about is why we should research digital media and what they are. And that question seems to have a simple answer. So digital technologies don't necessarily involve the internet. But I think that now, where we're at in 2014, especially in my context, which is in England, it's highly developed and fairly wealthy, digital and internet are kind of synonymous. They're kind of seen as being the same thing, but it is important to remember that they aren't the same thing. There are still lots of digital technologies which you don't need internet connectivity for. But as I say, it can be really difficult at the moment to use digital media without having, or at least being encouraged to have, an internet connection. So internet use is growing. I feel like I don't need to tell anyone in this room that, but I just gave 2 examples that I thought were really interesting. So in Poland, internet use among adults rose from just 20% in 2002 to 81% in 2022, so a huge jump in a 20-year period. But then even in countries that originally had quite high internet penetration in 2002, like South Korea, which had 67% internet penetration among adults, that's got up to 99%. So growing on a global scale while still recognizing access inequalities in lots of places around the world and in places you wouldn't necessarily think that they would be there. I'm going to come back to this Instagram post. It has context, I promise. So it's kind of become a bit of a cliche to say, oh, our interactions with digital media have changed so much in the last 20 years because everything's changing. You can kind of say that about everything, but they really, really have. I kind of wrote it and then took it away from the slide because I thought it was a bit cringe, and then I put it back in because I thought, no, actually, things really have changed. But I think that one of the biggest shifts is in the way we are using technology. I don't necessarily think that the biggest and most substantial shifts are in the technologies themselves. I think it's in the way that they're embedded in our lives. So I give some examples in a minute, but like we have laptops, smartphones, and we have handheld portable devices that move around with us. And that wasn't the case 20 years ago. And that, in terms of our relationship with the digital and our relationship with the internet, that's a really substantial change. And then fundamentally what this means is that there's been a growing shift away from what I'd call the spatial kind of fixity. I don't know if that's a word, I put it there, you'll have to tell me. But basically the idea that digital media, especially internet-connected digital media, are not really fixed anymore, and that's where these images come in. So if we go back to the first one, there's been, how many people use Instagram or TikTok here? I do, avidly. Okay, great. So a bit too much. I don't know how many people have noticed the rise of like nostalgia accounts. So they are typically like 90s nostalgia, 2000s nostalgia, millennial nostalgia. And they're really interesting, and I found this one on the Millennial Misery account, and the person says, I'm old enough to remember when the internet only existed here, and now it's attached to us like an organ. We can't function without it. And this is what I mean about this, like the fixedness or the fixity of the internet as space, is that, you know, when I was younger, I would come home from school and I would go to something, not that, my mum would never have bought that, but I would go to something like that, and I would sit down and I would go on the internet, I would be on the internet, I would become online. Whereas now I can put this phone in my pocket and walk around and my watch is online. You know, my whole being is online, my whole being is digital, and that is, to me, I think, a really profound shift. And then another one of these, because I love them so much, but it basically says the same thing. So the original poster says there was a time when we respected the computer, and then someone retweeted it or re-X'd it and said, sorry for being nostalgia beta, but it was kind of nice when the internet was a single, solitary, unmoving place instead of a terror that existed everywhere. You went to this specific spot to go to the internet, and when you left the spot, you left the internet. And what I think this quote does that is a little bit different to the previous quote is it's nostalgic. The whole point is the nostalgia. But actually, I think that where they say instead of a terror that extends to everywhere, that's really powerful. I'm not saying it represents everybody's opinions about the digital or internet connectivity, but I think it's really important that when we're mapping shifts in the digital, it's not just how many more people are using it. And it's even more than the kind of the shifts in spatial elements. It's discourses like this, like that it's now a terror that's with you all the time. And I just don't, there's a lot of growing research into kind of, like there's the Internet Histories Journal, and they've had a special issue on dead and dying platforms. And basically every article in that special issue said that there's this real romanticization of what the early web was, and we're seeing that now. And I think that the shift from what we saw as being this like lovely place that we went to, we could be anyone we wanted to be and it was exciting and special, to now just having this terror in your pocket, that's really, really powerful to me. And so I think that there are lots of shifts within the digital over the last 20 years, but that to me, the discursive shift and the spatial shift are two of the ones I think are the most profound. Just some examples of the digital being everywhere. You wear it in your ears, you walk around with it, you don't have to wire them up. You have it on your wrist, your doorbell can be digital now. You can't just push a doorbell and not be filmed. I don't have a Ring doorbell, but my mum does, and you have to be very careful. Like, you have to be silent when you go to her house. Like, can't say anything bad, you have to be silent because she'll watch it back. My washing machine texts me and screams at me when it's done. I can be on the train home from work and set my central heating. I could but would absolutely never buy glasses that film people. There are just so many ways that all of these objects at some point was not connected to the internet. And now they all are. And that, to me, again, is something that I think is very profound, and they're all within the last sort of 20 years, really. One of the other things I always like to drag out, because I'm a media comms person, is this cartoon on the left. You've probably all seen it, but it was from the New Yorker, published in, I think, 1993 by Peter Steiner. And it's, you know, really famous on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog, and it reflects this kind of early web discourse of kind of, you could go online and be whoever you wanted to be. Sherry Turkle wrote, as you'll know, a very famous book about it. But now, so that's 1993, and now we've got 2015. We see a lot of memes like this that are kind of a play on this original one, but this one is the NSA from the US, and it says, we know who you are, we know what you're doing. And then, you know, for a period of time, in around 2015, we had this kind of increase in awareness of surveillance technologies. We had an increase in press about surveillance technology issues and controversies. So we had that. So that was kind of the 93 to 2015 shift. And so I had mapped this out very neatly. And then I practiced this presentation on my best friend. She's called Elena Maris. She works at University of Chicago, Illinois. And she was like, no, there's something after it. There's a 2024. And I didn't really know what she meant, because I thought we were still there, honestly, in 2015. And she said, no, we're not. She said, because what we have now is jokes and memes and TikToks and videos that add a humorous dimension to surveillance technologies and government surveillance. So this was a BuzzFeed article that says 18 tweets that prove the government is watching you through your webcam. And then this is quite a viral one. It says, me covers the camera from my laptop's webcam with tape. The government agent always watching me, texting me, OMG, are you mad at me? And there's this trend that she told me about on TikTok, and then I went down a rabbit hole, and it's called My FBI Agent. I don't know how many people have seen it, but it's these videos, it's like, oh, my FBI agent when, and it's what the person who is supposedly watching you through your camera does and thinks and feels in certain scenarios. And we're in the 2015 state in that we know that things like that, not the exact thing, but that things like that are happening. We know that now. There's so much more public awareness and knowledge. Helen Kennedy, who's a professor at the University of Sheffield, she's done a ton of research about public awareness of data practices and produced some really fascinating results that essentially say awareness has massively, massively grown. But what we're seeing now is it's almost become like meta. And I think it's just an interesting point. And my friend thinks it's at a very interesting point where it's a meme now, it's humor. And I don't quite know what that means. I don't quite know what to make of it. But it's interesting, and Elena was right, it is a shift. There is a 2015 to 2024 shift, and this is one of them. So before I move on to the next section, as a conclusion, and to kind of move us into, okay, what does it mean to be a digital media researcher when you seek or strive for interdisciplinarity? What we need to remember is that early digital media researchers, for them, the digital was a place that you went to visit. So you read like Sherry Turkle's book, for example. I think it's called Life on the Screen, and they must always be read in the context in which they were written, where the internet was perceived of as being a place. It was not a perfect place. I don't believe it should be romanticized in the way that it is now, because there were so many structural conditions, even the setting up of the internet in the US and its links to like militarization. It was problematic from the get-go. But the point that I'm trying to make is that early digital media researchers did their job with different tech conditions and different discourses surrounding what they did. But as I've said so far, distinctions between the offline and the the online and the offline and the digital and the non-digital have almost collapsed in the last 20 years. And for many people around the world, not everybody, but for a lot of people, the digital feels like it is everywhere. And Christine Hine, some of you might have heard of a book that she wrote, I think it was out in 2015, it was called Ethnography for the Internet. And she proposed this notion of the E3 internet, and it was embedded, something and something else. One of the things was embedded, and she just wrote this really powerful case for the collapse of online and offline as useful distinctions anymore. Because when are you really offline? If this is on your wrist or your washing machine texts you, like when are you really offline? And it's just, if you haven't read it, it's a very powerful argument and piece. So to be a digital media researcher today, which lots of us in the room are, this means that you need to look to other disciplines for insight and context. And this was something that has been kind of alluded to all through the day, where actually, because the digital is now kind of everywhere, whatever you study, whatever you do as a digital media researcher, you have to look somewhere else to find something out. It's not really, it's almost like not a discrete discipline. You know, I would say, I'm in media comms, but kind of in sociology. I would never say, I'm in digital media research as a discipline, because I sort of don't personally think that it is. I would call it more of a sub-discipline, if that, but the point is that I think I'm within a discipline researching digital media and learning so much from other disciplines. But actually, what that is meaning is that many disciplines have what I would call a digital void. So this kind of absence, bless you, in knowledge and context about digital developments over the years, and are now looking to digital media experts. So you're kind of seeing this shift in knowledge exchange, which I think is really powerful. If you're studying mental health and social media, you might look to psychology or medicine. If you're studying mis or disinformation, you might look to politics, you might look to law. There's so many connections that you can make, but I think if you're someone now who is just starting out in their career as a digital media researcher, you'll find that your reference list for your thesis, for your publications, for chapters, anything, it is a bit of a mishmash now. I don't know how many other people feel this way, but I think mine are a bit of a mishmash from lots of different places, and that for me is because of the everywhereness of the digital. So one of the things that I want to convey today is that the way that we ask questions about our digital world really matters for the answers that we get. And it sounds really simple, but it is, I think, one of the biggest sources of contention when you're in an interdisciplinary team. I think for me, in my experience of working with people from a few different disciplines over the years, is it's not necessarily about the research design. It's more taking the very, very first step and saying, okay, what is the question? You'll generally have a shared goal, but what is the question? It's the way you ask the question that I've personally experienced the most sort of tension. So some might take a positivist causation-oriented approach, seeking to measure effects or causes or impacts of things. We often see this in relation to young people. So you'll see a lot of headlines that say, you know, Instagram is making people depressed, or that ask, are filters ruining people's body image, and so on. And they're kind of one-directional, quite causation-oriented questions and approaches. Others might take an interpretivist social shaping approach, asking about the relationship between digital technology and the people who use them, accounting for power imbalances and contributing factors. Neither one of these approaches is right or wrong. Neither one of these approaches is perfect, but they are different, and it is a bit of a different language and a different norm that we've been talking about today. And we see that in questions about the digital. We see that it's the way that questions about the digital gets asked that I think is really significant. And as scholars, the language that we use to ask questions really matters because it shapes the answers that we give. And I say this to, I've got a couple of PhD candidates now, one of whom has now graduated. But I always say, like, academic research is representation. through your publications, no matter what it might be, you are representing something. And actually, one of the things I always say is you've got no idea where that might go. Like, you might think you've produced this small niche bit of knowledge that no one will care about, and it will just be buried away in your thesis, but you don't know. You don't know where it's going to go, who's going to take hold of it. And so it's really important to think, how am I asking questions about the digital world? Does that reflect my philosophy, my epistemology, my methods that I'm using? Am I doing it justice, essentially? So I now want to get into a section about the promises and challenges of interdisciplinarity. There will be some overlap from what has been said today, but what I want to do is kind of frame them more in relation to the digital as a field of research and in some of my experiences as a digital media researcher. So a bit of definitional work for you. Interdisciplinarity, according to NET in 2018, was first proposed in the 1930s as a strategy to fill the gaps in a particular discipline or to surpass the limits of focus, methodological tools, theories and views that were offered by a single discipline. So it's the combination of more than one discipline, essentially. And, lots of things are said here that have been said today. So, for example, funding agencies now heavily prioritizing and focusing on interdisciplinary research, especially to solve these huge problems that relate to the digital. And we also see teaching programs focused on developing interdisciplinary courses and it being a word. So at Sheffield, one of the things I do is I do all the undergraduate open day talks. And I've done that since sort of 2017 and a little bit before on an ad hoc basis. And one of the things I've noticed is this word like creeping into student recruitment materials. It's quite subtle and slow, but it's happening more and more. So it's, for the last sort of 10 or so years, interdisciplinarity has very much become semi-buzzword, but something that is genuinely being lived through lots of fantastic projects. So what are some of the benefits and promises? I split these into two slides, but I just want to emphasize the kind of the interconnection between the promises and the perils. It was actually quite hard to separate it, but I thought this slide looked pretty, so I left it, but it's not to be reductive. So one of the things, these are the things I really like and value about interdisciplinarity. So I really love that it puts academic disciplines into conversation with each other. I think that that's really powerful. It just enhances your skills. At the end of the day, I'm personally an academic because I love to learn, I always have, and I also love to do the kinds of research that I do, which is to talk to people, especially children and young people, and get them to tell me what their experiences are. And one of the things I love about interdisciplinarity is that you're learning things you wouldn't have otherwise known. And these approaches can often lead to conclusions that couldn't have happened if you hadn't combined those disciplines together. That's what I think is really beautiful about it. And it allows for the embrace of complexities. It enables us to answer these questions that, as has been said at quite a few points today, we just couldn't answer from one discipline alone. There are questions that one team of researchers from one discipline wouldn't be able to answer, and it allows us to address those really big social problems that we're all invested in answering and solving. I like that it enables you to form parts of knowledge into a coherent whole, so like kind of combining points 1 or 2. When I really liked the opportunity to draw and visualize the concept earlier, because it made me realize that in my head it's all these different like jigsaw puzzle pieces that come together, that actually without them all you couldn't form the puzzle, the final thing. And finally, and this is really something that is in relation to digital media research, it allows you to kind of respect and document the longer histories of a subject. So I think one of the dangers or risks of kind of incorporating digital media into a research study from all disciplines is this feeling of newness and this thought that because the digital is quite new and rapid, what you are doing must be brand new and no one else must have done it and this must be a new question, when actually we've got decades of research into digital technologies that has more or less said the same thing for decades. It's just that the technologies themselves have changed. And that's one of the reasons in my opening slides I shifted away from the claim that the technologies themselves are the things that have changed. It's more about how we're using them, and it's more about the way that we talk about them and the way that they are kind of socially constructed and imagined. So you've got disciplines that didn't really formally engage with literature from, for example, media and communication or wherever digital media research is being published, that are now going to those fields to demonstrate that longer history. And I think it's quite nice and actually like a bit of a source of pride, actually, to be part of that history and to feel like you're useful in the sense of the thing that you're researching and the problem that you want to solve, but that you've contributed to building this knowledge base that actually loads of people are really benefiting from now because of the widespread nature of digital media. So these are some of the things I see as the real promises and benefits. Of course, it does have its challenges, and we've kind of gone through a lot of these today, so I won't dwell too much on this slide, but it kind of is like learning a new language, but not just the language, it's also the norms. So, you know, for example, if you are a co-author on a paper for a journal in a field you've never published in before, you have to learn so many new things that seems small, but actually you've got to learn all these different conventions and how much detail you put in and what the structure should be. And so it kind of, these challenges around language are not just in terms of engaging as a team in designing research, but they can also be the more kind of administrative tasks that you still need to do a lot of learning, and it's time consuming. One of the things, and I've struggled with this, is the differences in approaches to designing research questions, approaches to designing methods, and the kind of positivist versus interpretivist distinction. And I think it can be quite unappealing. I think one of the realities of interdisciplinarity is it's something that I think a lot of people are a little bit afraid of and find kind of unappealing, not necessarily through an unwillingness to learn, but through that it's a bit scary, actually, because you've spent decades having a very particular, for example, epistemological stance, and then someone comes in and has a very different one, and you get challenged on that, and it can be a little bit, I think, unappealing, not because it is not worthy or worthwhile, but because it's just a bit scary. It's just a bit stressful. It's just a bit scary. But I still don't personally think that outweighs the benefits. And it can be time consuming as an early career researcher. This got said right at the start of the day, but you know, by the time you finish your PhD, you are like a subject matter expert in whatever your rabbit hole is that you've gone down. But I think one of the nice things about, for example, postdoctoral study and about the project on which this spring school is based is that actually after the PhD, I think, is where you start to really learn what it means to take an interdisciplinary approach to something. You might become a team member on a highly diverse project, for example. So it's kind of, I feel like it's something that life gets breathed into it after the point of the PhD. And finally, I think there is a bit of a risk that it can be claimed tokenistically. I feel it's one of those abstract things, and it is a question I actually ask on the final slide, which is, how do you know when ideal interdisciplinarity has been achieved? How do you know what it looks like when you see it? But I think it's hard to know when you're looking at something that is a good model. But I think it's easy to spot when it is quite tokenistic. And I think because it has become a little bit of a buzzword, it has become something that funders, for example, increasingly want you to do, there is a risk of kind of misclaiming it. And one of the things I did recently was when a new undergraduate or postgraduate degree program in the UK gets proposed, the requirement is that you get an external advisor to kind of go through the materials and measure it against certain requirements and give some feedback. And I was asked to do it recently, and I reviewed one, which I'll keep anonymous, for obvious reasons. But they were saying, you know, the USP, the unique selling point of the program for them was that it was really interdisciplinary. But I really struggled with that because I sort of didn't think that it was, because what they were doing was combining people from disciplines that I think are very, very closely aligned anyway and have more in common than they do apart. And so even though, as I said earlier, media and comms and sociology might not sound all that different, there are some differences, but they're more aligned than, for example, sociology and economics, as an example. You don't think of those things immediately as being very, very similar. But what this program was doing was putting these very, very similar disciplines in conversation with each other and claiming something that I struggled with the claim, I'll be honest. And then, but then someone could easily say, well, it is interdisciplinary. I knew I'd get it wrong at some point, for these reasons. And so tricky to define, tricky to pin down. But I think one of the wonderful things about this event and the work that we've already done today is just how exciting it is, and it can be, and how it is the direction that lots of people are going in. And I'm really glad that there is an event dedicated to it, because I didn't have any, I didn't attend anything like this when I was slightly earlier in my career, and I just think it's a really fantastic thing to be able to do. So finally, before we move on to the next section, I think one of the things that got highlighted in this Guardian article is something I said earlier, which is kind of that the very nature of PhD study, the very nature of kind of having a thesis and doing, going down your rabbit hole is a little bit resistant to interdisciplinarity. And so there are lots of kind of initiatives and lots of articles and lots of people working to try to inspire that into a process which historically has kind of resisted it. So I do think things are kind of changing a little bit now. So what I'm going to do sort of in my final 10 or so minutes is just kind of step back in time and ask myself how I would have done something differently. So kind of very much inspired by the focus of this event, but also to teach myself lessons for the future. So I'm going to share a really recent research case study of mine, which was on anonymous apps and how I would have done it differently if I had designed it with a different lens. So for those of you who are aware, anonymous apps, they basically let you send messages to other app users without revealing who you are. So two people have an app. I send them a message. I know who I'm sending it to, but they don't know who has received it. They are immeasurably popular among children and young people, but they actually get really, really little academic attention. There's just very few kind of publications on them despite their popularity. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the apps tend to boom in popularity and then die really, really soon after. And so what you get is you get these individual apps that at a given moment in history were incredibly popular, but 2 weeks later or 2 days later in some cases, they've been taken down from app stores, never to be heard of again. And that makes them really hard to study. Because by the time we've got ethics and got funding and set everything up, it's like, oh, it's gone. It was here and gone in 2 weeks. So one of the things I've tried to do through the book is treat it as a genre and almost ignore what the individual apps are, because they all follow roughly the same structure, roughly the same kind of marketing premise, and they have roughly the same benefits and consequences. So they either work according to your location or your networks. So if two people have an app and they're physically in the same like X mile radius of one another, then you will show up on each other's apps and you can send each other messages. So these kinds of apps are really popular in schools and like university campuses. So Yik Yak is one that was super popular in the US, and it kind of died and then got reborn. or you can work them from your network. So you can actually hook them up to other apps and share your contact list from different social apps or from your phone. And as I say, they are tremendously popular, and they will often die after being taken down by their own founder or being removed from app stores, usually after a run of bad press or a legal case. So as an example of how popular they are, there was an app called Saraha, and it was founded and developed in Saudi Arabia as a workplace communication app to help employers and employees have more productive conversations. So the idea was that your boss could or one of your management team could send you a message without them saying who they were, and you vice versa could send it back. Anyway, I don't know, but teenagers loved it. And so this workplace, it had such a boring layout. I just can't understand how it got so popular. But at the peak of its popularity, 300 million users who were predominantly teenagers from over 30 countries just took it over and turned it into an anonymous app. It had 4 employees and 300 million users, and it just collapsed into itself. It was awful. It was so unsafe. And it had technical moderation infrastructures, but they were not learning quickly enough from the 300 million people who were using the app to learn and better. And then the 4 people who were just sat probably just sobbing every day couldn't keep up with the human moderation. It was one of those apps, there's so many debates around, is Instagram harmful? Is TikTok harmful? These are apps with thousands of workers and thousands of, people to control them. And that's why it's so hard to answer whether they're harmful or not, because there's so many moving parts. This was just objectively harmful. There were 4 people on an app with 300 million teenagers. But this is not a particularly sensational story. There are so many, every anonymous app has done this at some point. There was another one. There was an app called Fling. And the point of it, very sadly, was that you could send a picture of anything to a complete stranger around the world. So you can imagine in your mind what that app was used for. And there's an article in Business Insider, and if you Google Business Insider Fling app, it's one of the best articles I've ever read in my life. They had so few employees, and the founder just kept going to Ibiza. He was like, oh, I'm piecing out of this, I'm going to Ibiza. And he just left the chaos to all. It was just, it's a great article about a horrible thing, but very, very, very popular apps. Not many people talking about them. So I applied for some funding. I applied for a British Academy small grant just to find more out about them. And a lot of the academic publications on the apps tended to be more with older teens, so 18 and 19-year-olds in college campuses in the US. And there were also quite a few studies where no one had been spoken to, the users' voices weren't there. So I wanted to talk to younger teens and just be right, tell me how you use these apps, what they're for, what do you think, without any pre-judgment. I wasn't going in to measure harms, I wasn't going in to measure benefits. I was just going in to say, I'm a blank canvas, please tell me what these apps are for. And I found just some absolutely incredible stories. And most of the schools I went into did anyone ever watch Gossip Girl or is familiar with the concept? Yeah, so basically Gossip Girl was an anonymous blogger who received tips and then posted them to their blog anonymously. And this is what these apps were being used for. And I did research with 4 schools, but I went into 8 or 9, and every single one had a Gossip Girl anonymous app. And it was just there, ticking away in the background, posting things about kids. So, yeah, fun research. But if I was to do it again, so on reflection, looking back, if I wanted to say, right, I want to build a more complete picture of these apps, like I've produced a little bit of knowledge. A British Academy grant is not, it's funding, it's good funding, but it's only up to £10,000. And so you can't do a lot with £10,000. So if I was to get millions of pounds, what would I do? And so I kind of said to myself, okay, well, what skills do I already have? Like, what tools have I got? Cringe that I've used actual tools, but I thought it might be nice. So what tools have I actually got? So I've got research design skills. So I've got good contacts and networks within schools, which is imperative to build those relationships when you're working with children. Experience researching with children, experience with sensitive research like the mental health stuff, a good knowledge of the ethical challenges that might come up and the ways to kind of circumvent them. And then knowledge of my kind of overall research design, which for me is interpretivism and social shaping. I've then got research skills, so I'm a qual researcher, and I've used digital methods, interviews, workshops, thematic analysis, content analysis, and more. And then I've also got, as we all do, my disciplinary knowledge. Like I bring knowledge of this phenomenon. So internet histories, anonymity, youth and social media, sociological concepts that are really important for anonymous apps like stigma and secrecy, and finally content moderation. So I've, not to brag, but these are the things I have. But what do I not have? A lot. I don't have a lot. And I would love to build a team of people who has all these things that I don't have. And because I don't have the time to have all these new things, I need to just have what I have, carry on that path, and work with and learn from people who are experts in their thing. So I really would want a lot more knowledge around business and marketing. It's just something I don't really know much about, things like how you market an app, why these apps became so popular despite their intended audience not being teenagers. Why, like, how do you develop a startup? Like, if you sat there and said, I want to make an app, I would have no idea how to do that and what the different boxes you have to tick, what kind of people you need. I would love to know more about that. I'd love to know more about growth models and how you monetize an app, how an app becomes successful and has longevity. I just don't know a lot of these things in depth and would love to learn from someone who did. I'd love to know a lot more about the legalities, especially, so one of the questions that I have is, that I'd love answering is, so these apps to me have got some of the most sensitive data about children of any app out there, because the point of anonymous apps is that kids put their secrets on them. You don't necessarily put your secrets on Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat, but you are supposed to put them on anonymous apps. So to me, the data that app companies hold about children is unparalleled, I think, in the current app marketplace. But I don't know what happens to that data. Where does it go? Who has access to it? How do you get it? Is it ethical to get it? Is it legal to get it? What could we benefit as a society from having that data? So I have a few questions around that. And finally, from a computer science point of view, I don't know how to make an app. I could not do that. I don't know where the data goes, how it's organized. I couldn't build a technical moderation model. There are just so many things that I want to know about how you get an anonymous app from nothing to 300 million people. I would love to just know more about that journey that I don't know. And there are loads of things I haven't said here, that there are so many questions from so many disciplines that you could ask about the apps, like medicine and psychology and loads more. But of the things I want to know, these are the kinds of disciplines that I want to draw on and partner with and learn from. And to me, having all this knowledge would help us as a society to build such a fuller, more comprehensive and powerful picture of anonymous apps. And that's important because they're so popular with kids. And finally, before we move to Q&A, I just wanted to end with a few questions, and they're really big questions, but they're the questions that I'd left this presentation with and that I'm kind of carrying forward with me into the next couple of days. how do we know when true or ideal interdisciplinarity is being realised? So how do we know when it's being done tokenistically versus when it's being done what I would call kind of properly? What are the goals? What must it have to be something that can be defined as genuinely interdisciplinary? If you say, I'm taking an interdisciplinary approach to something, what do we really mean when we're saying that? What's the point of taking that approach? What are we seeking to gain from it? Where are the benefits? Where are the limitations? Like, why do we need it? I think that's a really important question. And finally, I'm thinking now in your minds about your work and you're doing, what part of your work might genuinely really benefit from interdisciplinarity? So I've kind of mapped out what I would have done differently, and that has shaped how I will think about my next projects going forward. So what do you want to know? Where might you get it from? And how might you kind of manifest and progress with that as you continue with your career? So just 3 huge questions to end on, but before we turn to Q&A, I just again want to say a huge, huge thank you to everyone who has listened to this talk, both online and here. A thank you again to the organisers, lots who aren't listed, but particularly those who I've been working most closely with. And finally to the catering and hosting teams here for putting on this wonderful event. I'm very, very grateful. And thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the fascinating and intriguing talk. And now we have a very generous space for Q&As. So the only important technical sort of note is that you need to speak to the microphone, so even sort of people that are listening us online can hear your questions as well. So if you have any question, raise your hand, please. Okay.
I have 2 questions for you. So you were mentioning this anonymous app, and we know that some people tend to bully others. And we know also that, like, for instance, there were young boys and girls bullying even self-driving cars. So the question is, are you aware, and can you mention some studies about this, related to this?
Yes, so there are quite a few different studies on anonymous apps, and one of the things that came out actually was there was a study by, I forget the first name, I'll find it, but it was Surname Black and other authors, and I think it was 2017 it was published, and it was published about Yik Yak. And they found that in their study of Yik Yak, the way that it was being used within the college campus within a certain age demographic at a certain kind of moment, they actually didn't find that much bullying. But then you get other studies of Yik Yak who found tremendous bullying. So it was kind of, I was really surprised to find that one that said, oh, we didn't find any bullying, because so many others did. And I found extensive bullying through the apps. There was one sixth form that I went into, so that's kind of 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are going to go on to either further study or the workforce. And someone in one of the schools I went to, someone had created, it was the name of the school and then confessionals, and no one knew who ran it, and you would send a message about your peers to this account, and then they would screenshot it and then cross-post it to a dedicated Instagram account. And so it was bullying, but it was bullying that was experienced really differently according to the identities of the kids. So it was like there were girls who would it was a predominantly white sixth form, and then the girls of colour who I spoke to were all like, I feel like I stand out anyway, and now I feel like I stand out even more. And there were a lot of girls who changed their behaviour and changed their clothing to make them stand out less. So a lot of them said, oh, we just wear like dark, baggy clothing now. Girls were wearing really baggy clothing so as not to like accentuate anything. And it wasn't even, what was really fascinating to me is that it wasn't bullying in the way that you would think of bullying. It was kind of harmful in, I think, a different sense, which was like it was the constant threat that you might appear on this app, and this constant, like, you're watching. One of my participants was like, I'm like watching myself being watched at. And she articulated it really well. She was like, it's like I've learned to view myself in the third person, and all from this app. And so there are studies on bullying. Bullying is found across the apps, but I think we need to widen the net actually a bit of what like the harms look like, because it wasn't just straight up. I didn't find just like straight up mean comments as much as I did these more pernicious, well, not more pernicious, but just a bit different.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And the second question would be, you were mentioning that you do research with teenagers. Can you say something more about that? Yeah,
so I had the anonymous app research, and then I've just moved into the digital photo editing space, where, again, it was the same. I kind of went into it with the same premise of like, okay, tell me what you think about digital photo editing. Do you do it? Do other people do it? And just having it as a conversation. But I think it's my part of my job I love the most, is to just go into a school and just sit there with teenagers and them just tell me everything. Like, it's the funniest, most fun thing. I just absolutely love it. And then I don't have children, so I get to go home and not have to deal with with it. So I really, really love that research, and it's something that now that I've done it, I can't ever imagine not doing. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for your keynote speech. So my name is Maria. I study political science, and my question is, so when you were speaking about your experience working with these non-anonymous apps, you were talking about your own experience of coming to schools, of researching kids, and all this stuff. So my key interest is about digital authoritarianism, how different autocracies use digital tools. We can see it almost in different parts of our world, like China, Russia, and other examples. And so what do you think about the researches that are carried out of these countries, out of the contact, like direct contact with those who are under this pressure and living under these circumstances? So what is your opinion when the target groups is not really easy to be spoken to?
Yeah, that's a really... Could you just keep the microphone for 1 second? Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to ask you to just... Because it's not... I obviously have opinions, but it's not what I do and it's not what I research. And I just wondered if you'd tell us a little bit more about like your research and what you've found, if that's okay.
So actually it's more about how different digital tools, like for example watchdogs, other ways of following people actions on the web affect their daily life, how they can somehow resist it. And also it's about like following transactions, following people on the ground by using digital tools.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, you know, the research that I'm doing is not within that kind of a context. But I had a student who, at Sheffield, we run this scheme called SURE. It's the Sheffield Undergraduate Research Experience. And you can get paired up with an undergrad who does a project for like 6 weeks. And I had a student, and what she really wanted to research was, we're trying to publish it as a journal article, actually. It's been going on for a while, but this concept of, she wants to call it group anonymity, which is where in China on Little Red Book and Douyin, people are using, it's called the Momo trend. And it's like everyone uses the exact same profile picture and just calls themselves Momo. And she's kind of theorizing it as something that is different to collective identity, whereas the point isn't to kind of connect and like make these contacts. The point is that it's almost like she called it their safety in numbers. And so that was the first time I had done research in that kind of context. And it was a really important context to have done, and it was really fascinating research. And we learned a ton from working together, and her telling me how she grew up and what she could do and what she couldn't do, and me telling her how I grew up and what I could do. And so it was I feel like it's not really answering the question, but the point is that it was a really fascinating piece, and I really love the concept that she got out of that.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm just starting my PhD in media studies and journalism, and I would like to ask you, as a senior researcher, how do you deal with the overwhelming nature of projects like the one you mentioned with anonymous applications that can be looked at from different points of view and disciplines from psychological way as a researcher?
Thank you so much for that question. One of the things I've done is, when I came out of my PhD, what I wanted to do was I didn't want to apply straight away for like a big grant with a team, or, you know, even have, like, for example, a research assistant to manage, because I didn't have those skills. I didn't have the skills to manage or to lead in that way. And so what I wanted to do was, I found a topic that I was really, really inspired by. Like, I'd learned a lot about anonymous apps through my students, and just through kind of the news and just kind of watching trends and watching what was going on. And I had developed, I called it my side project for ages, because I was doing the PhD, and then when the PhD was finished, I applied for funding to do it. But the British Academy grant that I got it was a small grant, it was just me. And I narrowed it. I looked at previous successful applications to that grant, and I had noticed like the approximate scale of, you know, a qualitative approach, like how many interviews you'd do roughly, how many questions you'd have roughly, and kind of scaled it. I mimicked what they did in terms of its scale, and then it was just me as a researcher. And then after that point grew and sort of developed the different skills, because you're totally right, it was really overwhelming at first, where you've had the PhD and you've done it, and then suddenly you have something new and there are all these expectations. So I thought, no, I'm just going to do something that's just me and it's of a sensible scale. And then kind of grew on projects where I was a co-investigator on a bigger team, and to eventually putting bids in where I'll lead a small team of people. So that's kind of the chronological order of dealing with the overwhelm. Is that helpful?
Yeah, because the goal as like adolescence experience, anonymous apps can seem like, how could I say it, terrifying. So it's a big goal.
Okay, any other questions?
Okay, I thank you for the lecture. When you mentioned the two approaches, that you know, some people have the positivist approach and they would ask, so what is the effect, what is the impact? And then I personally also am an anthropologist, a qualitative researcher, so I always reply, I don't know what is the effect, but it's a really complex and nuanced relationship. And they're like, okay, what do we do with it? So have you ever worked with people who take this positivist approach? Because in my experience, it's really hard to find a sort of a middle ground. So have you ever managed that?
Thank you so much for that question. So I'm gonna name my co-author because she would not mind being named. So I worked with, there's a really fantastic academic called Gemma Sharp. She's a psychologist. She's based in Australia. And we'd both been like thinking about kind of body image issues for a while. And she had some ideas for, in the journal Body Image, they do like kind of shorter reflection style pieces. And she'd had an idea for one, and she wanted to think about like future directions for the field in terms of social media and body image research. And she'd said, we've both got these ideas, we talk about them all the time, why don't we just write one? But then through the process of writing it just became really clear how differently we ask these questions. Like, she would say, what's the effect of this on this person or this population? And I'm really scared of asking that question because I just think, oh, but what about, you can't measure effect because how can you divorce social media from all these other 50 other things? But then she's saying to me, she's like, yeah, but you're not going to get anywhere if you have to account for absolutely everything. And we just had these conversations for so long, and actually I wouldn't call it we get on really well, it wasn't a tension at all, but exactly what you've described, those kind of mismatches in approaches kind of made their way into the piece. But it was hard because it made me think, gosh, if we were designing a project together, I just don't think I would feel comfortable with a question that seeks to measure impact or measure effect. And so I haven't dealt with it in that kind of scenario yet, where you're developing research questions, for example, for a grant application. I've dealt with it on a much smaller scale, but in a way that actually wound up being conducive to writing the piece that we wanted to write. So I'm yet to come across it in a bigger, so I don't know what I'd do, just cry, I don't know.
Are there any other questions? If not, then I will ask question and give you some time to formulate your ideas, if you will. So, Ysabel, you were mentioning at the beginning how you sort of often branch out of your academic career and you cooperate or you work on or sit on certain committees or give your expertise to sort of other stakeholders. So I was wondering if you could reflect on this experience and how and whether and how it's important for your work and whether being an interdisciplinary scholar or having an interdisciplinary approach sort of helps this cooperation with different stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I find it easier to work with public and third sector organisations because I think the politics are not just quite obviously not as messy, they're not as challenging. And I think I've gone into kind of a couple of policy organisations where I've generally been speaking to people who speak the same language as me. And so I would say those environments have been a bit more like everyone's speaking the same language, everyone's kind of agreeing on the same thing. The avenue where it was the most challenging was going into tech companies and being in environments where, like on the advisory board, everyone is from a different discipline. And it really is that it's not just academics either, it's like practitioners, kind of youth and social workers, like really quite a lot of different types of people. And what the point of the board is that they share suggestions for changes that they want to do. So it might be like tweaking the wording of, a trigger warning that comes up, for example, or a sensitivity screen or whatever, or changing the order of things. It's more like suggestions around content moderation policies, but also like small technical tweaks. And that's always really, it's just such an interesting space to learn from, to think about how people ask questions, the knowledge base that they have. And I think one of the things it's taught me is actually just to let certain things go. Actually, that it's okay if someone else asks a question in a slightly different way to you, or it's okay if you don't quite agree with the framing, or you wouldn't have used that method, or you wouldn't have drawn on that evidence base, or there are just things where I've just sort of had to let things go, because in my head I'm like, yeah, but the end, what they're saying and the shared goal is the same. They're just arriving at it differently. But I think it has definitely taught me about some of the promises and some of the limitations that I mentioned today, especially the tech ones, whereas the public and third sector, that's been a bit more, everyone's been a bit more aligned in terms of what we do. But yeah, it's a good question because it is something that, but it comes up in a way that I don't really realise it's happening until I reflect on it later.
Okay, any questions or comments if there are no more questions, then thank you very much for the really inspiring lecture once again. Sorry, it's been a long day. Round of applause, please. And also thank you everyone, participants who have been here the whole day with us. There's some refreshments at the back where you can sort of mingle and network. And then we'll see you tomorrow for another day of our spring school, where we will start with a really interesting talk about funders, and then we'll have our colleagues from sort of the creative and arts field coming over and sharing their experiences. Okay, so thank you very much and have a good evening.